The sun beat down relentlessly on the small, rural gas station as the old truck rumbled to a stop. Dust hung in the air like a thick veil, and the hum of the distant highway was the only sound breaking the stillness. The gas station was just a lonely stop for travelers on the edge of nowhere, barely more than a small building with a handful of pumps, a convenience store with a couple of aisles of snacks, and a weathered old man behind the counter who knew most of the locals by name. Victor, a quiet farmer in his early 50s, pulled up beside the pump, the worn-out truck groaning under its own weight. His hands were steady as he stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The truck had been his for years, a trusted companion through the rough fields of his farm. Today, though, the dusty truck seemed to mirror his own quiet life, a simple, no-frills existence, far from the chaos of the world. He'd come to this remote place to escape it all, leaving the hustle and bustle of the past far behind him. His work in the field had been long and hard, but it gave him peace. Farming was all he wanted now. He wasn't the type to stir trouble, preferring the simple rhythm of sunrises and sunsets, of working the land and tending to his animals. The world could turn and spin without him. He had made peace with that. As he filled the tank, the roar of motorcycles cut through the air, breaking the silence like thunder. 4 bikes pulled up to the gas station, engines revving and tires screeching against the hot pavement. The riders were a loud, intimidating bunch. Rough-looking men, tattooed and leather-clad, with the kind of attitude that screamed trouble. The leader, a thick-set man with a beard and dark sunglasses, led the group with swagger. The others followed, circling around Victor's truck, their bikes rumbling like predators closing in on prey. Victor didn't look up. He kept his focus on the pump, one hand gripping the nozzle, the other resting calmly at his side. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledging them. It had been years since he was part of the fast world, years since he'd been tested, but he still knew the feeling of being watched. These bikers were looking for trouble, and trouble usually found people like them. But he had no time for it. Rick, the leader, let out a loud laugh as he approached the farmer's truck. His voice was brash, his words loud enough to echo in the stillness. "Well, well, look what we got here, boys," he said with a smirk, looking over the dusty truck like it was something out of a museum. "What's this? Some old farm boy too dumb to know better than to drive a piece of junk like this?" The rest of the bikers laughed along with Rick, their voices boisterous, mocking. "Maybe he thinks he's still living in the 60s, one of them jeered, while another made a noise like a chicken, mimicking an old farmer. The air between them was thick with mockery, each comment more cutting than the last. Victor didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply let the words slide off him like water on stone. His life had been harder than their empty jabs, and he'd learned long ago not to care about the opinions of men who needed to act tough just to feel big. But Rick, sensing the lack of a response, wasn't about to let up. He took a step closer, closer than necessary, as if to push for a reaction. "Hey, old man," he said, leaning in, his voice a bit too loud now. "You gonna just stand there like a statue, or you gonna say something? Or is that the kind of guy you are? A quiet little farm rat too scared to talk?" Still, Victor didn't react. His hands were steady as he finished filling the tank. He could feel the bikers closing in, their eyes narrowing, sensing weakness or complacency. But he knew better than to rise to the bait. The quiet man had a way of making others come to him, and he had learned how to handle situations like this without raising a fist. Rick wasn't finished, though. He took another step forward, this time getting directly in Victor's face. "What's the matter, old man? You don't like my company? Or is it that you're just too pathetic to do anything about it?" Victor finally looked up, his gaze steady, calm, and unbothered. His face was weathered from years of hard work, his eyes sharp like a hawk's. He stood still, silent for a moment, studying the biker as if he were just another piece of equipment on his farm, something that didn't warrant much more attention than the plow or the tractor. "Listen, I'm just trying to fill my tank," Victor said, his voice low but clear. "If you're done with your little show, I'd appreciate it if you kept moving." He gave Rick a small nod, as though dismissing him. The bikers fell quiet. Rick stared at the farmer for a moment, a twitch of anger crossing his face. He hadn't expected that response. A man like this, quiet, calm, unshaken, wasn't what he was used to. What he thought would be an easy target had turned into an unexpected puzzle. "You think you're better than us?" Rick sneered, stepping even closer, but this time his voice was laced with something else. Doubt. What are you? Some kind of backwoods coward? Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture never changing. I'm not here to fight you, son, but if you want to keep talking, it won't be my fault if you get hurt. Rick's sneer deepened, and for a second, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, like he was trying to measure Victor up. This farmer wasn't some helpless, intimidated man. He wasn't rattled by the crowd of bikers, wasn't looking for approval, and Rick didn't like that. He took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation, but there was a brief hesitation. The air was thick with the challenge, a silent standoff. The bikers, sensing their leader's shift in posture, looked between each other. They were starting to realize this wasn't going the way they'd planned. Victor didn't wait for them to make the next move. With a slight nod, he turned and walked toward the door of the convenience store. I'm done here, he said over his shoulder, his voice calm, carrying a finality that silenced the laughter. But before he could make it to the door, Rick grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around with more force than necessary. You don't just walk away from me, old man, not without a lesson. That was the moment the bikers realized the quiet farmer wasn't the weakling they thought he was. The stillness in his body, the way he moved so effortlessly, was like a switch flipping in the room. The tension thickened, the moment of calm before the storm, and that was when Rick's mistake was made. Rick's grip tightened on Victor's shoulder as he spun the farmer around, his face flushed with rage. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The bikers fell silent, waiting for what would happen next. They had never seen Rick, the leader of their group, this worked up, and there was a certain tension in the air, like an invisible cord stretched too tightly between them all. The farmer, Victor, didn't flinch. His eyes were calm, unshaken, almost like he was observing an insect under a microscope, indifferent to the swarm around him. Rick's fist shot out, aiming straight for Victor's face, the kind of blow that would knock most men out cold. The bikers cheered, egging him on. It was the kind of fight they loved to see. Bullies who needed to prove themselves against someone they considered weak, someone they thought they could overpower. But there was no real malice behind their actions, just a need for dominance. It was the same game they played every time they rolled into town, looking for someone to pick on, someone to make feel small. What Rick hadn't realized was that Victor wasn't just anyone. As the fist neared his face, Victor didn't blink, didn't even lean back to dodge. Instead, with a fluid movement, he caught Rick's wrist in midair, his fingers closing around the biker's forearm with an iron grip. Rick's eyes widened with surprise as he found himself held in place, his punch stopped cold by a man who, in his mind, shouldn't have had the strength or skill to do such a thing. Without warning, Victor twisted Rick's arm, turning it with a precision that made the biker's joints creak under the pressure. There was a sharp crack as Rick's arm was forced into a painful position, the tendons straining against the force. He tried to pull away, but Victor's grip only tightened, the pain now radiating up Rick's arm, making him gasp for breath. You should have left it alone. Victor's voice was calm, almost measured, but there was an edge to it now. His eyes never left Rick's face as he spoke, his hand holding the biker like a rag doll. The crowd of bikers around them had fallen silent. The laughter had stopped, and what had once seemed like an easy confrontation now felt like something much darker, something they had not anticipated. Rick gritted his teeth, the pain surging through his arm, his pride rattled. He wasn't used to being the one who was dominated. He was the one who dominated. He was the one who picked on people like Victor. But now his world was upside down. A farmer had put him in a position he couldn't escape, and the realization hit him like a wave. He had picked the wrong person to mess with. I don't want to hurt you, Victor said quietly, his grip unyielding. But you're leaving me no choice. With a swift motion, he forced Rick to the ground, pushing the man down with unmatched strength. Rick crashed to the dirt, his arm bent awkwardly beneath him. The breath was knocked from his lungs, his chest heaving as he tried to gather himself. The other bikers stood frozen, their bravado faltering as they watched their leader fall, humiliated in front of them. For a moment, there was a strange, uneasy silence in the air. Victor didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command attention. The farmer had not struck a single blow, yet he had incapacitated the loudest, strongest member of the group. His movements had been precise, controlled. This wasn't just a man on a farm. This was a man who had lived through things none of these bikers could even begin to comprehend. Rick groaned as he tried to push himself up, his face red with fury and frustration. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" He spat, his voice hoarse from the shock of the fall. "You think you can just walk all over us?" Victor crouched down beside him, his movements slow and deliberate. "No, Rick," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I don't think I'm a tough guy. I think you picked the wrong man to mess with. You wanted a fight. Well, now you've got one." He let go of Rick's arm, allowing him to slowly rise, but keeping his eyes locked on him. The bikers who had once cheered for their leader now stood uncertain, their confidence shattered. For a long, tense moment, Rick and Victor locked eyes. Rick was seething, his pride hurt more than his arm. He wasn't used to being humbled like this. But as much as he hated to admit it, there was something in Victor's demeanor, in the way he moved, that was unmistakably dangerous. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was the kind of quiet confidence that only someone who had been through hell could carry. Rick finally pushed himself up, brushing the dirt off his clothes, but he didn't take another step toward Victor. He was no longer sure if he had it in him to go another round. He couldn't figure out how this quiet, unassuming man had flipped the power dynamic with such ease. "You got something to prove, huh?" one of the other bikers muttered, his voice wavering now. The mockery had disappeared from his tone, replaced with something like fear. Victor turned his gaze toward the other bikers, his eyes cold and unwavering. "I don't have anything to prove," he said simply, his voice carrying an authority that no one could ignore. "But you all need to learn something. When you pick on someone, when you think you're better than them, make sure you're not picking the wrong fight." The bikers hesitated, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. Rick, still simmering with anger, looked around at his men. His pride was damaged, but he couldn't ignore the fear now rising in his chest. What had started as a chance to belittle a quiet farmer had turned into a confrontation they hadn't been prepared for. The power had shifted, and they could feel it. Rick gritted his teeth, but stood up straight. He gave a curt nod to his gang, signaling that it was time to leave. They had no choice but to retreat, their egos bruised, their leader defeated, and their pride shattered. Victor watched them go, his eyes steady. He didn't feel the rush of victory. He didn't need to. His body had remained calm, his heart steady. He hadn't needed to strike a single blow to win this fight. He had outwitted them, shown them that strength didn't always come from size or rage. It came from the kind of quiet confidence that only someone who had faced the worst could carry. The bikers sped off into the distance, their engines roaring down the road, but the tension still lingered in the air like smoke. Victor turned back to his truck, his movements unhurried as he resumed his task of pumping gas. He didn't need to boast. He didn't need the attention. He was a retired Navy SEAL commander, and sometimes the greatest strength was knowing when to remain silent, knowing when to let others make their move. As the sound of the bikes faded into the distance, Victor couldn't help but smile quietly to himself. He had gotten his peace back, and for now, that was enough. Victor finished filling the tank and moved toward the convenience store with the same slow, deliberate steps. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline that came from a good fight, nor did he feel relief from seeing the bikers ride off with their tails between their legs. He had simply acted. A part of him wondered if they would take that encounter as a lesson, or if they would just forget it the next time they picked on someone they thought was weaker than them. He stepped into the store, the door jingling behind him. The quiet hum of the old fridge and the soft clink of a soda bottle as he grabbed it from the shelf was all that filled the space. He moved to the counter and placed a few bills in front of the cashier, an older man with graying hair who gave him a nod of acknowledgement but said nothing. The farmer simply nodded back, offering no words, just a silent exchange of recognition, like it always had been in this town. The cashier gave him the change, but his eyes lingered on Victor for a moment. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he held himself back when everyone expected him to lash out, made people uneasy. Most didn't know his true story, what he had been, what he had done before this quiet life on the farm. But there was something about him that made even the most hardened men think twice. Victor didn't care for the attention, didn't need it. He had no desire for recognition. His life was simple, and simplicity was something he fought for. No, the satisfaction came from knowing that sometimes silence was enough. The world had a way of teaching lessons if you were willing to listen. He walked back to his truck, his boots clinking softly against the pavement. The air was cooler now, the day turning toward evening. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the smell of the earth, fresh after the sun's heat, filled his lungs. He didn't think much about the bikers. They were gone, and he had nothing left to prove. But he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps, somewhere in the back of their minds, they'd be thinking about him for a while, thinking about what happened when someone didn't react the way they thought he would. As he slid into the driver's seat of his truck and started the engine, he felt the weight of the moment sink in, but it didn't faze him. His hands gripped the steering wheel, and he let the truck roll out of the parking lot, the engine rumbling steadily beneath him. But just as he turned onto the highway, his rearview mirror flashed with headlights. A few minutes later, the familiar roar of motorcycles reached his ears again. Victor didn't react. He simply continued driving, his eyes focused on the road ahead. They had learned nothing from their earlier encounter, and that made him smile slightly. There was a part of him that wished they would just leave him alone, but he also knew there was no way they would forget what happened. As the bikes pulled up behind him, their engines roaring louder with each passing second, Victor's grip on the wheel tightened, but only slightly. This time, though, he didn't pull over. He just drove. It wasn't long before he could hear the unmistakable sound of the bikers revving their engines and trying to pull up alongside him. Rick was the first to make his move, attempting to speed past Victor, cutting him off in an aggressive maneuver. Victor's gaze flickered over to the bikers, his expression still calm, his mind already calculating what would come next. They were angry, frustrated, and they couldn't let go of the humiliation they had suffered. They had to prove something. Rick took another chance, his bike swerving dangerously close to Victor's truck, trying to force the farmer off the road. The others followed, the bikers showing no fear, their faces contorted with the need for revenge. Victor's fingers flexed around the steering wheel. He hadn't come looking for a fight, but sometimes fights found you anyway. He pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing the truck forward, and in one swift motion, he swerved the truck just enough to nudge Rick's bike off balance. The biker was forced to swerve back to regain control, but not before a loud clunk echoed in the air. The rest of the bikers, seeing their leader's near miss, hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between retaliating and realizing that this wasn't a fight they could win. But Rick wasn't ready to give up. He revved the engine, the roar of his bike reaching a deafening volume. "Get out of the way, old man," he shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. Victor didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. The truck rumbled along steadily, its engine sounding strong beneath him. Rick took a wild swing, trying to get close enough to the truck to cause some damage, but it was then that Victor's patience ran out. Without warning, he slammed the truck's brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Rick, unable to adjust in time, lurched forward, his bike skidding out of control. The sound of metal grinding against concrete rang in Victor's ears, but he didn't flinch. Rick's bike careened into the guardrail, and he tumbled onto the pavement, his body skidding for several feet before finally coming to a stop. Victor's truck slowly rolled to a stop as the other bikers rushed to their leader's aid. He didn't get out of the truck. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was deep as the bikers hovered over Rick, who was slowly picking himself up from the ground, his face twisted in pain and embarrassment. For a moment, no one spoke. Victor lowered the window of the truck, his voice steady but cutting through the tension. "You might want to take him and leave before I finish this." Rick stood up, holding his side, and looked at Victor. He was humiliated. He had been a bully, the one who laughed first, the one who thought he could intimidate someone weaker than him. But now, here he was, staring at a man who wasn't impressed by his threats, and it was a humbling realization. Rick's gaze shifted to the other bikers, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, they all nodded in unison. They helped him up, lifting him onto his bike, and without a word, they turned around and sped off, leaving Victor to his peace. As the roar of their engines faded, Victor sat in the truck for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't need to chase them. He didn't need to prove anything. What he had done wasn't about showing strength. It was about teaching a lesson. And as he sat there, watching the dust settle on the empty highway, he knew it had been learned. The farmer had won, without ever throwing a single punch. Victor sat in his truck for a few moments longer, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, his mind quiet as the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance. The road ahead stretched out in front of him, a ribbon of asphalt leading into the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting a warm glow over the farmland that surrounded the gas station. For a brief moment, everything felt still, as though the world had paused, holding its breath. The wind blew gently through the open window, carrying with it the scent of earth, grass, and the distant promise of rain. The sky was a pale blue, transitioning into soft oranges and purples as the day turned to night. Victor felt his body begin to relax, the tightness in his shoulders and back starting to ease. He had always loved this part of the day, when everything settled into place and the rush of the world seemed to slow down. It was a peaceful existence, one he had chosen after years of conflict, a life he had fought for with everything he had. He knew the bikers wouldn't come back. The message had been sent, clear and unspoken, and they had understood it. For someone who had spent years in war zones, had faced the worst humanity had to offer, there was little that could rattle him anymore. And though the confrontation had been brief, it had felt like a quiet victory. Not a victory for him personally, but a reminder that not everything was about force. Sometimes the strength you held was the strength you chose not to use. Victor exhaled slowly and put the truck in gear, slowly pulling away from the gas station. He didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know the bikers were long gone. He simply kept his eyes on the road, his movement steady, his mind already returning to the fields, to the work that needed to be done. It wasn't long before he reached the dirt road that led up to his farm. He turned the wheel and began to drive up the winding path, past the barns, the fenced fields, and the quiet stretch of land that he had cultivated for years. The house sat at the far end, an old structure that had weathered storms and time. It was nothing grand, but it had character. Just like everything else here, it was his haven. As the truck bumped along the uneven road, he caught sight of the cattle grazing near the pasture, their slow, deliberate movements, a calming presence. The animals didn't care about the confrontation he had just endured. They didn't care about his past or his decisions. All they cared about was the rhythm of the day, eating, drinking, and living in peace. It was simplicity, and it was everything Victor needed. He parked the truck by the barn, cut the engine, and stepped out. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the fields, but he wasn't in a rush. He took his time, walking toward the barn with the familiar sound of his boots crunching against the gravel. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, looking out over the horizon. The sky was fading into twilight, and the world felt quiet, almost like it had been waiting for this very moment. He didn't hear the sound of tires until they were nearly at the end of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires signaling the approach of a vehicle. At first, he thought nothing of it. People didn't usually come up this way, not unless they had business. And business around here was usually rare. Victor's gaze shifted toward the headlights of the approaching car, squinting slightly against the glare. It wasn't a local, he could tell. There was something in the way the vehicle moved, slightly too fast, slightly too direct for someone unfamiliar with the area. He leaned against the barn, watching as the car came to a slow stop at the end of the driveway. The engine cut, and the headlights dimmed. A figure emerged from the driver's side, tall, imposing. For a moment, Victor felt his heart rate tick up. But there was no tension. This wasn't a confrontation, not yet. He could feel it, a sense of something familiar, but the connection didn't come immediately. The man walked toward him, his movement steady and sure. He was dressed in dark clothes, but it wasn't the clothes that gave him away. It was his presence, the quiet confidence that spoke of someone who had seen the world for what it really was, someone who didn't need to announce himself. Someone who had the same kind of peace Victor had. "Nice place you've got here," the man said as he neared, his voice low and measured. He wasn't trying to make small talk, but it was clear he wasn't here just for a visit. There was purpose in his words. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sized up the man, keeping his posture relaxed, his hands in his pockets. He had learned to trust his instincts, and there was something about this stranger that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that, like him, this man had been trained for something. But trained for what? Victor's voice broke the silence as he straightened, his gaze steady. "I'm not looking for company," he said, his tone direct, no hostility, just a simple statement of fact. "If you're here for trouble, you've come to the wrong place." The man stopped a few feet in front of Victor, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was a pause, and Victor could see the stranger's gaze flicker for just a moment, like he was deciding how to respond. "I'm not here for trouble," the man replied after a long beat, "but I'm here for answers." Victor felt the weight of the words settle over him. Answers. His mind quickly went through the possibilities, but the man's presence was so disarming, so familiar, that for a brief second, he wasn't sure whether to trust him or not. "You know who I am, don't you?" the man asked, his voice still calm. "I've been looking for you for a long time. It's not easy to find a guy who wants to disappear." Victor's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He knew. For the first time in years, Victor felt his past coming rushing back at him, like a wave that couldn't be stopped. This man, whoever he was, had uncovered something that Victor had tried to bury, and for all the peace he had found on the farm, in this quiet life, he knew it was about to be shattered. There were some things that you couldn't outrun, no matter how hard you tried. Victor looked the man in the eye, his voice low but steady. "What do you want?" The man didn't hesitate. "I want to know what you're going to do next." Victor stood still, his body taut with tension, as the man in front of him spoke. The words, "I've been looking for you," echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. For years he had worked to bury his past, his days as a Navy SEAL commander, the battles, the missions, the things he had done. All of it had been left behind when he moved to this farm, when he made the decision to walk away from the life of violence and chaos that had defined him. But now, the past was back, knocking at his door with the force of a storm. Victor's eyes never left the stranger's face, studying him, weighing the intent behind his words. This man wasn't a typical traveler. He wasn't a threat in the way the bikers had been, aggressive and reckless. But there was something familiar about him, something calculated. His calm demeanor only made Victor more suspicious. "What do you want from me?" Victor asked again, his voice quiet. But there was an unmistakable edge to it now. The peace he had worked so hard for was starting to feel fragile, like glass cracking under pressure. The man didn't flinch at Victor's tone. Instead, he stood tall, his posture relaxed but purposeful, as if he wasn't intimidated by the farm or the man who owned it. "I know who you are, Victor," he said, his voice steady. "I know what you've done, and I know why you're hiding." Victor's mind raced. He was trying to keep his cool, but the tightness in his chest betrayed him. "I'm not hiding," he replied, his voice more forceful now. "I've earned my peace here. I'm not going back to whatever it is you think I owe you." The stranger took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, assessing Victor as though he were a puzzle that needed to be solved. "It's not about what you owe me," he said, his tone softening just a little. "It's about what you owe yourself, and what the world owes you." Victor clenched his fists, irritation flaring inside him. "I've paid my dues," he snapped, his words sharp. "More than anyone should have to. I don't owe anyone anything." The man nodded slowly as if he understood, but his gaze didn't waver. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty, Victor, but you should know, there's still a price on your head, a debt that wasn't paid. The people you turned your back on, they haven't forgotten you." Victor's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. The memories of who he had been, of the missions that had defined him, of the things he had done for the sake of the greater good, came rushing back. He knew exactly who the man was talking about. "I left that life behind," Victor said firmly, his voice quieter now, but with conviction. "I'm not the same man I was." The stranger didn't seem moved by Victor's words. He stepped even closer, closing the gap between them. "You think you can just walk away? You think the CIA and the people who used you would just let you go? There are things you can't outrun, Victor. People you've hurt. People who need you to finish what you started." Victor's jaw tightened, his breathing slow but deliberate. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. He knew exactly what the man was getting at. There had been unfinished business, things he had left behind in the dark corners of the world, people he had fought for, and people he had fought against. He had thought that coming here, to this quiet patch of land, would give him the peace he so desperately sought. But peace, it seemed, was never meant for men like him. The stranger's voice was low, almost a whisper now. "I'm not here to drag you back, Victor. I'm here to tell you that there's still a chance to finish this. The people who betrayed you, the people who erased you, they're still out there, They're still controlling things, and the only way to stop them is to face them head on. Victor's mind raced, memories flooding in. The years of operations, the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. He had walked away from it all, but there had always been a lingering thought in the back of his mind. The people he left behind, the people he failed, they were waiting and he had been running from it. "I'm done," he said quietly, his voice steady now. "There's nothing left for me in that world." The stranger's gaze hardened, his eyes sharp. "Maybe not for you, but for the rest of the world. There's a lot of people depending on someone to stop the madness, and you're the only one who can do it." Victor's breath caught. He had hoped, for just a moment, that he could walk away and leave all that behind. But it wasn't that simple. It never was. He had learned that the hard way, and the hard truth was this: the world didn't forget. And no matter how far you ran, you couldn't outrun the ghosts of your past. "I'm not your hero," Victor said, his voice soft but firm. The stranger stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "No, maybe not. But you're the only one left who can end it. You don't owe them, Victor. You don't owe them anything, but you owe the world this." Victor was silent, his eyes drifting toward the distant hills. The weight of the decision hung over him, but deep down, he knew the path ahead. He knew that the choice had already been made for him, long before he came here. "You've got a point," Victor finally said, his voice almost a whisper, as though he were talking to himself. "But I won't be alone in this." The stranger gave a small smile, almost as if he expected that answer. "You never were alone. There's a whole network waiting for you." Victor stared into the distance for a long moment. The peaceful life he had worked so hard to build, the calm he had found in the rhythm of the farm, seemed to slip further and further away with each passing second. He had been running, but the world always found a way to catch up. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I'm not going back to the man I was. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it on my terms." The stranger nodded, his expression softening. "That's all anyone can ask." Victor turned back to the barn, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like an old, familiar burden. His mind was already working, preparing for what would come next. The fight he had left behind, the unfinished business, had found him once again. And though he had hoped it wouldn't, he knew deep down that there was only one thing left for him to do: face it. With one last glance toward the horizon, Victor knew that his quiet life was over. The world needed him once again, whether he liked it or not. But this time, he would do it his way. The past would no longer define him. He would define the future. And with that thought, he walked back toward the barn, his resolve hardening, ready to face whatever came next.